I'd like to introduce our last speaker for today, Sebastian Stober. Sebastian has a PhD in computer science and a mixed background between applied machine learning, music information retrieval, and cognitive neuroscience. Since January 2016, he's leading a research group on machine learning in cognitive science at Potsdam University. And Sebastian is particularly interested in so-called human-in-the-loop scenarios in which both humans and machine learn from each other and together contribute to the solution of a problem. Today we'll be talking about music imagery and deep neural networks. So please welcome Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and also thanks to all the organizers for putting together such a great event. It's really exciting to be part of this. As you said already, my background is in computer science, and since 2006, I've worked in the field of MIR, that's music information retrieval. And then about 6 years ago, I stumbled across the work of Rebecca, and that got me thinking, all these methods that we develop in MIR, couldn't we apply them also to extract music information from brain signals? And that's when I dubbed the term music imagery information retrieval, and I've been working on this ever since. That started with a postdoc in Canada from 2013 to 2015, where I visited the Brain and Mind Institute in London, Ontario, and worked together with Avital Sterning, Jessica Gran, and Adrian Owen. And we were looking into ways how to use music imagination in a brain-computer interface scenario. So that was meant for patients with disorders of consciousness eventually. And that's where all the experiments were conducted that I will describe today, and that's also where I started to develop deep learning techniques for analyzing EEG. So before we start looking at the experiments, I think in a interdisciplinary setting like today, it would be a good idea to first introduce what deep learning actually is. So this slide kind of depicts how most machine learning solutions have been engineered since maybe the 1980s or even longer. We first take some data. Where's the mouse here? Okay, we got some data here. And then we extract handcrafted features. Based on these features, we then train a classifier. And that classifier basically is then a model that allows us to predict labels for data we haven't seen before. Right, so that's a normal pipeline, and the problem here is that a lot of work actually goes into handcrafting these features for the specific purpose. Yeah, that takes a lot of effort and domain knowledge usually. Now with deep learning, we can learn these features too. That's a big novelty. Most importantly also, we can learn those features in something that's called pre-training. So that's an additional phase in the machine learning where we can even use unlabeled data, so we don't need labels at that stage. We're just interested to learn features that describe the data well, and once we got these features, we can then train a classifier on top of this. And now, thanks to powerful computers and graphics cards, we can also handle large amounts of data. Actually, most of this works exceptionally well when you have large amounts of data. It doesn't work so well when you don't have so much. Now, this is why deep learning is drastically changing the way we solve machine learning problems nowadays. And so within the last few years, it has broken lots of records, one after the other, in a wide range of benchmarks. This quote here actually refers to computer vision problems, right? And in computer vision, really nowadays, there's hardly anybody who uses handcrafted features anymore. Most people use deep learning. But deep learning is not yet dominating neuroscience. It's becoming more and more popular, mostly in the MR domain, where we're still talking about images to some extent. Not so much for EEG, but there is something going on already. My guess would be maybe another 5 to 10 years, and this will be a major thing in neuroscience too. All right, now when we talk about deep learning, we usually refer to deep neural networks. And deep neural networks themselves are a special case of artificial neural networks. Artificial neural networks are a popular technique from machine learning, which is one of several ways to implement artificial intelligence. Right, so now that you know where we are. And our artificial neural networks, they work with a very simplified neuron model. So if you have a background in neuroscience, you say, well, this is super simple, how can that work? Basically, these neurons just compute a weighted sum that you see here. So we have some incoming connections, all have a different weight. We combine this in the sum, and then we apply a nonlinearity here. Then this determines our output. And that's it. That's our simple neuron model. And the neuron can basically learn by adapting those incoming weights, basically making sense on how to weight the different input signals. And now, one neuron alone is not enough. We have to put them into networks, and one of those simplest architectures is the multi-layer perceptron. Here, the neurons are organized into layers. So we got an input layer, we got an output layer, and then we got something in between that's not connected to the outside world directly, and that's why we call it a hidden layer. And when we have more than one hidden layer, usually people talk of deep learning. That's the vague definition. And in these models, I forgot to mention this, neurons in one layer are always only connected to the next layer. They're not sending signals anywhere else. That's the important structural constraint here. Now, when we put multiple hidden layers together, we can basically learn increasingly complex features, and this is a toy example that's supposed to illustrate this. For instance, in the case of distinguishing different animals, where you can see how the features increase in complexity. So this is detecting simple shapes and then detecting body parts and then finally detecting the full shape of the animal. Of course, in reality, it takes a few more layers to actually accomplish this. The interesting thing is that there is theoretical proof that basically MLPs with just a single hidden layer can detect arbitrarily complex patterns. But they might need a lot of neurons for this. And an alternative would be to use deep networks that need fewer neurons eventually. Now, how do these networks learn? I already mentioned that you can adapt the connection weights. And there's a general purpose learning algorithm to train almost any kind of network architecture based on examples. And this is done in two phases. So first we have a forward propagation phase where we compute the activations of neurons layer by layer. So we start at the input, then we compute the activations of the hidden layer, then of the output layer, and then we get some output. And then we can compare this output to what we actually expected based on our training data. And based on this, we can compute an error. And the way we compute that error is very important because it determines our training signal. Once we get that error, we go into the second phase. So that's the backward propagation, where we basically go layer by layer backwards, asking how do we need to change the weights in between the layers such that the error decreases once we see the same training example the next time. Yeah. And so learning essentially becomes an optimization problem. And this optimization is not trivial. So modern networks may have millions of parameters. Yeah, this is a very simple network. We see here normal networks have way more parameters, and learning can easily get stuck in a local optimum. It's not guaranteed to always find the best solution. Right, so that's the tricky part about deep learning. And so it has become kind of an art to find networks that are easy to train. And as you can see here, there's a huge variety of neural networks. You don't have to understand all of these, just to show you the variety, and those are actually just the most generic types. And so we've seen the multi-layer perceptron already up there, and I'd like to introduce you to two more network architectures. That's the convolutional neural network down here and the auto-encoder. So the idea of using convolution in a neural network is also inspired by neuroscience, by how the real brain works. So in the visual cortex, there are specialized groups of neurons that can detect the same visual stimulus. And we call this a filter. And each neuron has a different receptive field, so it's seeing only parts of the complete input, but they all share the same filter they can recognize. And that's basically also what we do in a convolutional layer, in a convolutional neural network. So let's say this is an input image here. of a 5, handwritten 5, and then we move a filter over that picture and compute for every position. Every position is one receptive field of a neuron. We compute the similarity of this filter to the underlying receptive field. And if we put all these similarity values together, we get this output picture, which is called a feature map or an activation map of that filter. And it basically tells us where in the input is the specific pattern defined by the filter present, to what extent. And now this, it's a bit like applying a Photoshop filter. Yeah, so this would be our Photoshop filter, and this would be an image, and that would be the effect afterwards. But now we're actually learning this filter. So this filter is not predetermined by us, but we have the network figure out what would be a good filter to obtain a goal in the end. And we can have multiple of these filters in parallel. It's not restricted to just applying one filter at a time. And now, oh, what's going on here? Now if we stack multiple of these, we can actually mimic how visual processing pathway works in the brain. Yeah, going back to our initial example here, we could say maybe this is like stuff that happens in V1, and then further down the line, we have higher level processing going on. Now, over the time, I've experimented with a large variety of network architectures for EEG analysis, and my experience is that the convolutional neural networks are actually the most powerful tool that we have here. So they always produce the best results, and this is also backed by a recent paper of Schirmmeister et al., who actually say that CNNs with appropriate design choices, that's always the restriction, you have to make good design choices, reach at least the accuracies of filter bank common spatial patterns for motor decoding from EEG. Yeah, that's for a special scenario, but also in the experiments that I have done, I've witnessed the same. All right, and then the other architecture I wanted to introduce is the autoencoder. The autoencoder already goes back to an idea from the 1980s, and there are now many different flavors of autoencoders. Basically, it's a network, first of all, that you can train on unlabeled data. You don't need labeled data for this. That's a big advantage. And what it does, it basically takes some input, and then it has to compute some representation from this. Usually that's kind of a bottleneck, so it has to compress the information to some extent, and then tries to reconstruct the input information again. Yeah? In order to be able to do this, it has to figure out what are the most important features in the data. It has to find a good representation scheme. And that's, again, just a toy example here to give you some idea of how this could work in reality. This is an example from 2012. Where like Google engineers trained a huge network that was shown images from YouTube, and it had to reconstruct those images again. And after a week of training with massive hardware, this network actually had learned the concept of like a stereotypical human face, and also the concept of what a cat face looks like. What you see, where is it? Down here. All right, now with this, I'd like to move on to the first experiment. And so back in 2014, inspired by Rebecca's work and the recent advances in deep learning, we wanted to attempt single trial classification of music perception and eventually also of imagination from the EEG. And so the data we collected has now been published as the so-called open MIIR data set. It comprises 12 stimuli and EEG from 10 subjects, where one of the recordings is not that great, so I would rather say it's 9 subjects. But if you want to use it, you're free to do that. We put very special effort at making sure that this data is released under public domain. So you can do whatever you like with this. There's no restrictions. And this is something I would encourage people to copy, actually. It took some time to convince the ethics board to approve that, but yeah, it's possible. Now, deciding on the stimuli was not easy, actually. We wanted a kind of balanced set with as much variance as possible, because we didn't know which kind of musical features would stand out. So all the stimuli had to be well-known pieces, and we decided they had to start on the downbeat. This is because we wanted a cue click to precede the piece, and when you also think about people have to imagine this later, and they're not like musically trained, they might have problems with not starting on the downbeat. So we decided only pieces with downbeat start. And in the end, we got 12 audio stimuli from 8 music pieces that you see here. We got 4 songs recorded with and without lyrics, so we got 2 versions of these. And then we have 4 instrumental pieces. And those versions actually are tempo matched. They both, we had to do some time stretching sometimes to make sure that worked. I'm just going to play all of them for you in a small mashup.
Chim chimney, chim chimney, chim chim chiree.
Take me out to the ball game.
Jingle bells, jingle bells.
Mary had a little lamb, little lamb.
All right, so we have several balanced classes here. We got 3 groups of 4 stimuli each, and then we also have 2 different meters. We got 3x4 and 4x4. So this is how the data was recorded. It comprises 64 EEG channels. We also recorded eye movements, and the data sampled at 512 hertz. And one special thing here is this device, which makes sure that we have a high synchronization between the audio that's presented and the EEG recording, which is at like 1.5 milliseconds or something like this. So it's a very high synchronization. And the experiment had basically 2 blocks. In the first block, we recorded 3 trials back to back for each stimulus. So first, the participants heard the cue clicks that you just heard in the example, followed by the music clip. And so that was a perception trial. Then afterwards, they heard the clicks, and then they had to imagine the piece. So it's like a cued tempo imagination. And then they had to do this without tempo cue. They just had a fixation cross that would vanish when they had to imagine. And finally, oh yeah, we did this 5 times in random order for the 12 stimuli, and then we had the second block where we did the third condition again, but this time they hadn't heard the piece just before that. So that's more like realistic if you want to do this in a brain-computer interface scenario and people have the option to imagine different pieces. You cannot present the pieces just before you record the imagination. And here we had people actually give feedback on whether they thought they did a good job at imagining things. There are several issues with this setup, and we'll come back to that later. So now for this data set, we started out to try to recognize the music stimuli from the perceived EEG first. So this is single trial classification with 12 classes. And for this specific task, here are the numbers. So if we cut all the trials at 6.9 seconds, that's the length of the shortest stimulus, then we roughly get 225,000 features or values for each trial. But in total, we only got a little more than an hour of data distributed over 540 trials. And this is actually quite the opposite scenario of what you typically have in deep learning. Usually your data is not as big in terms of how much a single instance is, but you have many more examples. So for instance, like in ImageNet, which is one of the most popular cases for deep learning, an image has like around 150,000 dimensions instead of 225,000 here, and they got millions of images for training. So how can we approach this problem here? So first of all, we can think about reducing the dimensionality. And there's some options here. Of course, downsampling is always an option you can try any time, but you have to see how much harm it does. And then for this data set, actually, we found that keeping the original sampling rate, 512, works a little better than going down to as much as 64 hertz, for instance. The other 3 options, they're actually learning features that are representative for the data, and they will look something like this. So these are the 4 most prominent principal components, for instance, if you look at the data. The problem here is, those are spatial filters, right? That basically describe a weighted sum of the different EEG channels, how you combine them into this component. And you can do this the same way with an autoencoder, the method I showed you earlier, which is technically, if you set it up like this, doing something like a PCA, but in a nonlinear way. So it has the option to also apply nonlinear transformation there. But eventually you get something very similar to this. The problem here is actually that these filters will capture everything, the whole thing now. And you're actually interested only in the part that's related to the music, right? So there's so much else going on. And we want to go and figure out what that signal is. Now, how can we do that? So the first approach I came up, or what I first explored are convolutional autoencoders. So again, this is an autoencoder using the convolution operation. So in the encoder, we apply convolution, as I showed you earlier. And then in the decoder, we do the opposite, we deconvolve. It's a transpose of the convolution. And yeah, so this is a lossy process, so there's a bottleneck somehow in the middle. We have to define this. There are different ways to do this, for instance, by adding noise. And then eventually we train that network by minimizing the reconstruction error. Yeah, that's the basic idea behind that. And now in our case, the data looks something like this. So we got 2 dimensions here. One is the channels, the EEG channels. There's no specific order imposed here. And then the other direction, the other axis is the time. We could also have 3 dimensions if we decompose each channel into frequency bands, of course. But for now, let's keep it simple. And now for spatial convolution, that means that we take a column out of this 2D matrix, basically one step at a time. We multiply it by those weights defined by our filter, and this will give you a time sequence, a single dimensional time sequence. And then for the other way around, we multiply this time sequence with the deconvolution filter weights, and we obtain a matrix like this again. Yeah, that's the whole idea. And of course, you can have multiple of these filters in parallel, so you get multiple time courses in the middle, and so on. Okay, so far for the basic autoencoder that learns the full brain activity, and now what we're going to do is we want to exploit the synchronization between the trials. You know, we always made sure that the audio is presented very well synchronized to the trials, and we're going to exploit this to find similar temporal patterns that are induced by the audio. So what I first did is change the way the autoencoders are trained. So instead of having an input trial that is reconstructed, I paired the input trial with another trial that was to be reconstructed. And this way I'm forcing the autoencoder to pay attention to signal components that are stable across trials. Right? That's the only thing that it can exploit to do well in this task. And now that we train on pairs of trials, this also increases the number of training instances combinatorically. So when we had, let's say, 4 trials to train on per stimulus, then we have 12 now, because it's 4 times 3. Now, naturally, we would like to pair trials within subject. That's what I tried first, but we can also try to pair trials across subjects, right? But then there's individual differences that come into account, and somehow we would like to compensate this with our network architecture. And one way to do this is what I call a hydra net. That's why there's this hydra up here. To illustrate this, that's our convolutional autoencoder from earlier, but it's just drawn bottom to top. Yeah, so we get the same filter here. But now we're looking at 2 different trials, and they're from different subjects. Now, instead of having the same encoder for all subjects, we can have them individualized. So we have one encoder for each subject, and we basically choose this encoder based on the metadata from the trial. Yeah, and now this is a HydraNet layer. And we can do the same transformation to the decoder, and this time we just select based on the trial metadata from the target subject. And so for instance, let's say we want to reconstruct a trial from subject 6 as a trial from subject 11. In this case, we first select the encoder for subject 6, and then the decoder for subject 11. And then we get some reconstruction, and we compare this reconstruction to what we wanted to obtain. We get an error, and we update everything only along this path, right? And we do this for all the different combinations many, many times, and then the network will learn something like this. And this actually gives us much better pre-trained filters. But we can actually do better than that. So far, basically, the idea is we have found stable features across trials, even across subjects. But what we would eventually would like to have when we want to classify the different stimuli is that we have features that are distinguishable between the different stimuli. And in order to do that, we also have to take into account other trials from other stimuli. So the idea is now that we're looking at triplets of trials where two trials belong together. They come from the same stimulus, and the third element is from a different trial. And we want to make sure that the representation that the network learns for those two trials that belong together is more similar than when we compare it to the other trial. And there's, I mean, in machine learning, there's a huge field out there that's just dealing with these kinds of problems. So it's metric learning. Now, how can we implement this in the neural network? The idea is, if this is the schematic of our autoencoder, we have like the convolution in the encoder, the deconvolution in the decoder. We are now only interested in what comes out of this convolution part of the encoder. So we can forget about the decoder. And now we're interested in processing 3 trials at the same time. So we actually replicate this pipeline 3 times. It's exactly the same pipeline. One is for the reference trial, one is for the paired trial, and one is for the other trial. And so those trials are processed, and afterwards we compute 2 similarity scores, and then we predict the score that is higher. And that's essentially now a binary classification problem. Right? So it's either this trial or this trial that's the most similar one to the reference. And you can train this like any binary classifier now by minimizing the violations. And so that's what we did. Just as a reminder, that's where our former encoder is, just replicated 3 times. Okay, now let's look at the whole big picture. So we now have a 2-stage training approach. And the first step, we're trying to learn features by exploiting the synchronization between the trials. And the goal is to find representative features that capture the differences in the music stimuli, and this way improves the signal-to-noise ratio. And then in a second step, we're just going to apply a simple classifier. We got 2 versions here. We either apply a support vector machine or a simple neural network with just 1 layer. And this is like in more detail. So we do a doubly nested cross-validation scheme if you're interested in this kind of stuff, but I think that's not so important for today. Basically, what we do is we do things across subjects. So we train always on 8 subjects, and then we test on the 9th. So the system has never seen anything from the 9th subject. And what we see here, so our network is very simple. We have just 1 convolutional filter, and that's what you see here. We just have 1 convolutional filter, but because we train in 9 faults, one always leaving 1 subject out, we get 9 different versions of this filter. And this is just the average of all these 9 different versions. And here you can see the variance is very low, actually. They agree a lot, those filters. All right, and if we use these filters and do the classification on top of this, this is what we get. So our baseline, these are the 3 lines up here, are a support vector classifier just using the raw EEG or just the channel mean, or we have an end-to-end neural network. That means we use the same architecture, like with the convolution and then the classification layer, but we don't do any pre-training. So we just set the structure and then train for the classification. And then those 2 are the condition where we pre-train and then apply a support vector classifier or a neural network. And so what we see is that there's a substantial increase in the signal-to-noise ratio. And this is the mean over the different subjects. we got subjects where we have over 50% accuracy, and then some that are just barely above 20. So we're not sure what the background is there. I would assume it's actually signal quality or even cooperation of the subjects, which is an issue I want to talk later about. All right, so if we look at the confusion matrices, this is also very interesting because you recall we have these tempo-matched stimuli with and without lyrics, and we can see, for instance, in this parallel diagonal here in the confusion, that there's actually confusion between the stimuli with and without lyrics, which totally makes sense. They're tempo-matched, they have stuff occurring at the same points of time, so that's obvious. And that makes the problem actually harder for a classifier. Because we have a very simple model, we can actually visualize it. So you've already seen this filter, and this is the average of the temporal patterns that the classifiers use to recognize the 12 different classes. So we got the 12 different classes here, and for each class we have a temporal prototype, if you want, that the outcome of this convolution is compared against. And if we look a little bit closer at this, we can see that there are similar patterns for the lyrics non-lyrics pairs. For instance, here with the 1 and 11, you can see that there's, for instance, a strong negative weighted section here that's almost at the same spot. If we analyze the filter activation, so that's basically the output of the convolution before we do the classification, we notice that it's picking up musically meaningful events such as downbeats. For instance, here this is a downbeat of the third bar. And there's a very strong signal here that was not so prominent in the original input. And we can see this also for other stimuli. Now, if we wanted to recognize the meter, we can use the exact same approach for stimulus, as for stimulus recognition. Just now we have 2 balanced classes instead of 12, so the chance level is around 50%. But if we now use the methods that we used for the stimuli, it does not work well here. And that's very interesting. It seems like there exists no simple spatial filter that makes the perception of different stimuli in the same meter more similar. But that might also be the case because the stimuli all have different tempo, so the meter, like downbeats, actually appear in different positions. Interestingly, if we use the filter that we trained for the 12 class problem, we actually do much better. And it seems like there's actually information there that goes beyond just the information about the 12 classes. So that dummy line here basically refers to just predicting which of the 12 classes it is, and then from this deriving what the meter would have been. Right? So if we know it's stimulus 1, we know it's 3 by 4. And so by using the output of the filter, we're actually doing much better than this baseline. So there's more in that signal that the filter gets out of the EEG. Similarly for the group classification, so we have lyrics, non-lyrics versus instrumental. The chance level is 33%. Here again, it's the best option to actually use the output from the 12 class encoder and not train a different encoder just for this condition. But the reason might be that our encoder is just too simple that we used here. So our neural network just had one convolutional filter, that's not a lot. And if we wanted to detect something like the presence of lyrics, it's probably something more sophisticated that we need to do. Okay, so now what if we try to classify the imagination traits? This is what we're really interested in eventually. So if we're using the same pre-training technique, we get hardly above random accuracy. And most likely this is due to the poor timing of the imagination, because we just give them, in the click queue version, we just give them the tempo and then they are off to imagine whatever they think. And so they might run out of sync really quickly, and our method that we used here requires quite a high synchronization between the trials. So that's not working well. If we use the same pre-trained filter that we use for perception and try to apply this in imagination, same problem, we don't have the synchronization, so those filters are worthless here. So with this result, we decided to redesign the experiment and see what we can do with the higher synchronization of the imagination trials. And this started just before I left the Brain and Mind Institute and went to Potsdam to build my own lab. So with the lessons learned from the first experiment, we aimed for the following improvements. We wanted to have more control about the timing during imagination. We wanted to have a quality check. That was another problem because people could just wander off. We've heard about mind wandering, right? And there's no way to check whether they actually did what they were supposed to do or they almost fell asleep or went through their grocery shopping list or something like this. We also wanted fewer stimuli, so we would have more trials per stimulus to train classifiers. And we wanted to have the same stimulus lengths because in the first experiment we ended up cutting off a lot of excessive audio in the end. And we wanted loopable stimuli that would allow us to collect more stimuli at the same amount of time. We didn't have breaks between them. And eventually we also wanted more trials. Of course, you always want more data. So the idea was to use rhythmic speech and synthesized beats for stimulation. So this is going a little bit away from like the full range of what music can be. But we always had our BCI setting in mind. And so these 4 sentences that we came up with are actually things that you might want to say in a BCI setting. You want to communicate this. And by using stimuli that directly contain this message, it's much easier maybe for the person who wants to use the BCI to actually do this. We had 2 versions of the stimuli. One was spoken, like in the imagination, and the other one was sign tones, just to like have the rhythmic information but not the speech information. And they were looped, and this created this song to speech to song illusory transformation. So you really felt the rhythm there. And to show you that, I'm going to play back one example. So we have the clicks in the beginning.
Yes, I'd like that. Yes, I'd like that.
So that's
yes,
one example.
I'd like that.
And then that would be the. No, hang on. I'm not seeing this down here. Oh yeah, okay, here we go. So that would be the beep version of the same stimulus. Okay, now they're all at the same tempo at 120 BPM, but they all have different rhythms. So we again have 2 in even meter and the other 2 in an odd meter. And there's stuff happening between the beats sometimes, so they all have their idiosyncrasies. And after 6 seconds, which you see here, they all start at the same position. So that's our minimum period of repetition. And so with this, we designed the following experiment. We had 2 repetitions of the 6-second frame for perception. And then the playback stopped and only the click continued, and then you had 2 repetitions where you had to imagine things. And then this is a new thing, we had a test tone in the end that was either on the downbeat or off. And that was a way to figure out whether people actually went through with the imagination, because if you don't know that next thing is a downbeat, and you cannot tell whether this is actually right or wrong. And so if they were wrong, we could say, okay, maybe they didn't imagine things properly at that point in time. For presentation, we started with the trials where we only showed presented the beeps, so they didn't know what the language was behind that, so they wouldn't accidentally think the words at that point in time. And then later, we only presented the spoken trials. So there was no cross effects. So far, there's data for 7 subjects. We actually recorded more, but there was a technical problem with the EEG, unfortunately, and so we only have 7 so far. Now, even though we thought it would be much easier to work with this data, it seems it's actually much harder. Our pre-training approach that I've shown you, that worked before, for the first experiment, and we also tested this on other data sets, so like for chord perception and that kind of stuff, and it worked really well there. It did not work here. And the baseline was really poor, so we're not sure what the problem is. So it could be that the stimuli are just too similar temporally, because they all have the same tempo, right? And they all have the click present in the black background, and that might be too much, actually, of a stimulation. Not sure about that. It could also be that we still have problems with data quality, actually. We didn't get very far there, but fortunately, my PhD student, Andre, who is going to have a poster later on, had some exciting new results using a different approach, where we did not try to classify the different stimuli, but trying to reconstruct the audio stimulus. And I would like to outline the idea briefly, but for this we need to go a little bit deeper into this small bubble here, which is generative deep nets, or deep generative nets, which basically refers to the most recent development in deep learning. You could say there are three phases. People started to do unsupervised pre-training 10 years ago. Then once there was enough data, it moved towards end-to-end training, where you don't do pre-training anymore. And now, since like 3 years ago, roughly, not 3 days, that would be way too recent, but 3 years ago, there's generative training. Now, why generative training? So the general idea is that a generative model can, or is trained in a way that it's able to generate new data that looks like the training data. And that way, you basically, if a model is able to do this, you would say, okay, it has understood what the data is about to some extent. And this is very promising for unsupervised learning again, also for semi-supervised learning, where you have some data that's labeled, others not, and also for limited amounts of data, which we have in our case here. Now, one popular approach of generative models are variational autoencoders, and they are basically an extension of the autoencoder idea that I presented earlier. And here the big difference is actually that, in contrast to the classical autoencoder, everything is probabilistic, especially that bottleneck here in the middle. So the encoder part, that's this, is now determining the parameters for a probability distribution here. That could be the mean and the variance, for instance, of a Gaussian distribution. And then the decoder has to sample from that distribution, so it's getting a point in that space. And then from there, it transforms the sample back into something that looks like the input. Yeah? So this becomes a generative model, this part here. And we still try to minimize the reconstruction error like before. But additionally, we want to make sure that we don't diverge too much from a prior that we specify for that distribution. And that becomes our representational bottleneck that actually encourages meaningful, feature-rich latent variables that we can learn in this space. So what we get in the end is something like a predictable coordinate system that our data is mapped into in a way that neighbors in that space are actually very similar in the input space. And here's an example for these written digits. So we have classes from 0 to 9, and this is showing us how they are mapped into a two-dimensional representation space. And you can see, like, based on the colors, that they're always similar, or like numbers belonging to the same class are mapped close together. Now, what's really interesting now is, because you have a generative model, you can also see how data is generated from this by sampling from that latent space, for instance, in a grid structure like here, and you can see how this is mapped to generated images. Hang on, something is missing here. Oh, funny enough. I think I've deleted the slide. Here it is. Just going to improvise. Okay, so now we can extend this idea to something that's called deep variational canonical correlation analysis, long term. Bear with me for a moment. So the idea is we have an encoder like before, that's this one here, where we feed in the EEG. And we will derive a latent representation out of this. And from this, like before, this is a distribution. We get to sample from this. We're going to transform the sample back to something that looks like the EEG in the first place. This is this pass to the left. And then, additionally, we can have more decoders for different data, different modalities. And in our case, this is going to be musical features that we can derive from the stimuli. So we're going to reconstruct the Mel spectrogram, the loudness envelope, the trial type, stuff like that. And the most important thing is that this representation here in the middle is going to be used for all of this. So we have a shared representation, and the idea is that this forces the network to capture musical concepts in the data, basically musical concepts that are present in the EEG. Okay, let me get back to the original presentation. Now, one back. Here's what we get when we reconstruct the Mel spectrogram from the EEG. This is from a model that was trained on a single subject. And you can see the target, which is the actual Mel spectrogram on top, and then the reconstruction on the bottom. What I find really interesting is this row here, where you can see it really picks up the metronome clicks. So this is obviously from a beep trier. Yeah, so it's very sparse signal. But it also is able to figure out that there's something here. And this is related to the stimulus, to the variation that we induce by the beeps for the specific stimulus. That's different from just the clicks that are in the background. And now the latent space that we have here is obviously much more complex than these 2 dimensions that we've seen in the example. But we can still explore it, and the idea is now to interpolate between different points in the latent space, and basically you get to a point in the latent space by using an actual EEG recording. You compute what would be the coordinates of this recording in a space that could be the one up here, and then you have a second one, and then you create points in between and feed this into the generator network, into the decoder, and this is what it will look like when you generate the Mel spectrograms. And you can see that along this line where we interpolate, it's shifting the position of the beats in the spectrogram, which totally makes sense for such a sparse signal. And then this would be the reconstructed EEG corresponding to this. Okay, so this should be enough as a teaser. If you want to know more, please visit Andre's poster afterwards. And with this, I would like to come to my conclusions. So I hope that I have convinced you that deep learning is a powerful tool for EEG analysis, but there are several roadblocks still, right? First of all, it's if you want to apply it successfully, this still requires quite a bit of programming skills, and that can be a problem. Then on the other hand, also, you might want to interpret your models. You want to figure out what they have learned. I was able to do this to some extent here because we used simple models so far. If you make them more complicated, it gets much harder to figure out what they're doing. So if you want to obtain insights from these models, this is still an open research problem. We're working on this. We're actually applying methods from neuroscience to try to analyze what these artificial brains are doing, but there's still way to go. And then, I would say the generative models, they show a lot of promise, especially for our cases here, and especially with the multimodal embeddings. My recommendations are, well, this is best applied within interdisciplinary collaboration, so if you would like to collaborate, talk to me. I am very open to that. And the other thing is, please share your data. That would be great, because at the end of the day, you could say data is all we need for these methods. They're very data hungry, and right now we're just working around the problem of having not enough data. They would work so much better if we had plenty of it. So if anybody, for instance, has data where they recorded EEG while people listen to music or something auditory, I'd be happy to get a hand on that. So with this, thank you very much, and very happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for bringing here this very interesting field of research. So, yeah, let's see if there are any questions.
I've got a quick question. This was done all with EEG data, is
Yes.
that correct? What about fMRI data? Has this been done with this as well? Would this work? Because I think the Google project that you showed with vision was done with fMRI data, or was this?
No. This was just like a neural network that was digesting images from YouTube and trying to reconstruct them.
Right,
No neural stuff in there.
But would it in principle also work with fMRI data, or
Yes.
are there other issues involved?
No. I mean, like with fMRI, there's some technical issues, or technical challenges, but there's work doing reconstruction with fMRI, and I'm not an fMRI expert. I've not worked with fMRI so far, but we're really interested in our multimodal approaches actually to add fMRI as another modality that would maybe even allow us to bridge like fMRI and EEG, you know, like feed in fMRI and generate something like what the EEG might look like, given that fMRI, and vice versa. So there are many opportunities. It's hard to get data sets. Yeah, that's the main issue.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Are you aware of any studies that look at motion segmentation and EEG correlates? The reason why I ask is because of this intermittency issue, which is very tricky. We assume that it exists, but we have a very hard time documenting where it exists.
I'm afraid I don't know. I could do some research on that, but right now I can't say from the top of my head, sorry. I think Rebecca had a question.
Thanks so much for this. This is really interesting stuff, and it's so exciting to see that you're applying these new methods to this problem, because I think the problem needs it. I have one small clarification question from actually quite early on in your presentation, where you mentioned the number of dimensions that are related to the stimuli, I think, and you came up with 250,000 dimensions. I was just wondering, where do they come from?
Yeah, it's not really like dimensions. So it's related to the trials.
Right.
So to the EEG, not to the stimuli. So if you take, it's just simple math. So if you say you have 64 channels, you have 512 samples per second, you have roughly 7 seconds per stimulus, you end up with 225,000 values. I should rather say values instead of dimensions.
Yeah. But, well, that makes it a little bit easier for me. Thanks. I was thinking about how difficult it was for you to classify these categories in terms of meter. I forget the other one. The three class.
The types, lyrics, non-lyrics, instruments.
So, do you have an idea about why? Because I think it seems to be that the individual characteristics of the music are sort of overriding these category characteristics, right? And
at least for the network that we trained.
Of course,
yeah.
Disclaimer. Yeah. Have you thought of other ways to categorize the stimuli that you have? Yeah.
So there's. I got another slide where I tried to like map them emotionally.
Yeah.
And so there's stuff that stands out, like this Darth Vader theme from Star Wars, for instance, or Harry Potter, or stuff that you associate with visual imagery, actually, that might dominate your experience of that. We've not tapped into this because it's only like 1 or 2 stimuli that have this property, and to do this like systematically, it's tricky.
Yeah. Sounds like a great idea. Can I ask more? Sorry. I was wondering, you had a imagery that was introduced by clicks versus imagery that wasn't introduced by clicks. Did you find any difference in the detectability there?
They were equally bad.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. We'll talk more later.
Okay, thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask if you or people in your field care about how similar the deep neural networks that you you have to the biological, if you try to make them biologically plausible. And I thought about it because some months ago I read this interesting interview to Carl Friston, which is this very prominent neuroscientist, and they asked him, how many levels of hierarchy do you think there are in a brain? A very hard question, and you would expect him saying there's no way, but he said 6. He said that he thinks that there are 6 levels, and that there is enough evidence to think that that's a good guess. So, and I'm imagining in your case that would amount to having 6 layers on a simplified model. So, yeah.
All right. So, first of all, I think it's a really good question that I get asked quite frequently, also by my students. How much are we still like in line with real neuroscience, right? And I have to say, not so much anymore. Like the models are very simplified. In fact, I mean, like real neurons, they have spiking behavior, right? That we don't model here. There is work in artificial neural networks that is developing spiking neural nets. Problem is that the training algorithms don't work so well, like the backpropagation stuff that I mentioned. You have to adapt this, to fit the spiking behavior. And there's work there, but it's not yet entered the mainstream. That would actually lead more towards something that's more like closer to the actual behavior of the brain. In terms of the number of layers, there have been networks, very successful networks in the computer vision domain that have like 150 or even like 1,000 layers. And then it's no more really like this, this view where you have abstraction levels, but then people rather say that it's a refinement of the signal with each layer. So it's a very different perspective. These networks are also designed differently. So you have, for instance, instead of only having connections from one layer to the next, you have shortcuts that go around some layers, or something that is very popular are residual connections, where the idea is you have a path that goes through transformations, and you have an additional path that goes around them. That's the identity. And so the idea is you have the identity is forwarding your original signal, and then the path that goes through the transformations is actually trying to refine that signal and then adding something on top of it in the end. And so this refinement idea is taking over now instead of having this abstraction idea. So maybe 6 is actually a good number, but with these new designs, people rather have more layers to do stuff, if they have the data for it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other question? Okay, then let's thank again Sebastian.